August 15th, 1944. Saipan Island, Mariana Chain, 98 degrees Fahrenheit under a sun that punished everything beneath it. Ko's legs stopped working at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon, her body collapsing onto packed dirt that rose in a cloud around her fallen form. The dust settled on her torn dress, her bloodied knees, her outstretched hands that had failed to break the fall. 23 years old, a nurse who had spent 3 years learning to save lives, now unable to command her own limbs to move. She had been told what would happen next would be worse than death. The scream tore from her throat before conscious thought could stop it raw, an animal, the sound of a body betraying itself. Pain radiated from her lower spine like electricity, through water spreading, consuming, turning her legs into foreign objects she could see but not feel. 14 women stopped walking, their wooden sandals ceasing their scrape against the road. 2 American soldiers turned rifles, lowered, confusion crossing their sunburned faces as they processed what they were seeing. Ko tried to push herself up. Her arms responded. Her legs did not. The disconnect sent fresh waves of terror through her chest, worse than the physical agony, because she understood what this meant. In war, the weak were abandoned. In Japanese military culture, the injured who could not continue were expected to handle the problem themselves. She had seen it. She had helped prepare the means. A small blade, a quick cut, honor preserved. But when the American medics saw her twisted body on that road, they did not laugh. They did not walk away. They ran toward her. And that choice, made in seconds by men who owed her nothing, would shatter everything 15 women believed about their enemy. The story begins 2 weeks earlier, when Ko still believed the propaganda. July 30th, Japanese military hospital, Saipan. Ko moved between cots arranged in rows inside what had once been a school building, now converted into a makeshift medical facility that smelled of antiseptic, failing to mask gangrene. 40 beds, 38 occupied, 2 soldiers dying despite her best efforts. She checked vitals, changed dressings, administered morphine in doses so small they barely dulled the pain because supplies had stopped arriving 3 weeks ago. The American invasion fleet had cut off all shipping lanes. What remained in the medical stores had to last until either reinforcements arrived or they all died trying to hold the island. Neither outcome seemed likely to favor the Japanese forces. She had wanted to study medicine in Tokyo, had received acceptance to a prestigious program before the war consumed all plans for all futures. Her father, a teacher, had saved for years to afford the tuition. Her mother had sewn her a new kimono for the entrance ceremony. Instead, Ko had watched American bombs destroy the harbor, had volunteered as a nurse when the military requisitioned all medical personnel, had learned to perform amputations and debridements, and to lie to dying men about their chances. The other 14 women working at the hospital had similar stories of interrupted lives. Yuki had been engaged to marry her fiancé, killed at Guadalcanal before the wedding could occur. Sachiko had taught elementary school, her classroom now rubble. Micho had studied literature, her books burned for fuel during the previous winter. War had taken their futures and handed them blood-soaked bandages in return. The propaganda officer arrived on the afternoon of July 31st, his uniform crisp, despite the heat, his face carved from certainty that permitted no questions. He gathered all the women in what remained of the school courtyard, where broken concrete and dead grass bore witness to battles already lost. His voice carried the authority of someone who had never doubted the righteousness of his cause. The Americans are not soldiers. They are beasts in human form who wear brutality like a badge of honor. When they take prisoners, they do not extend mercy. The men they execute. The women they use for pleasure, for sport, for experiments that make death seem like kindness. This is not speculation. This is documented fact from Nanking, from Manila, from every territory they have touched. You have a choice to make when they arrive, and they will arrive. Die with honor intact, or live as a vessel for their depravity. He showed photographs, grainy and horrible images Ko could not determine were real or fabricated, but which burned into her memory regardless. He recounted testimonies from refugees, stories so graphic that 2 younger nurses vomited into the dirt. He explained with the patience of a teacher instructing slow children that American soldiers viewed Japanese women as subhuman, as objects to be discarded after use. The officer handed each woman a small cloth bundle. Ko opened hers to find a straight razor, its edge catching the afternoon light. For when the time comes, he set his tone, suggesting he was offering a gift rather than a method of suicide. Your families would prefer to mourn your death than live with your shame. Ko stared at the razor. Her hands, which could suture wounds and set bones and ease suffering, trembled, holding an object designed to end her own life. Around her, the other women stood silent, processing the same impossible calculation. How much fear would it take to choose the razor? How much propaganda would need to be believed more than possessed? As it turned out, though, she would not realize that until the moment came. The Battle of Saipan, which American historians would later call a decisive turning point in the Pacific War, felt less like a battle and more like an apocalypse to those trapped inside it. July 7th brought the final Japanese offensive, a banzai charge of 4,000 soldiers and civilians armed with rifles, swords, bamboo spears, anything that could be weaponized in a last desperate attempt to drive the Americans back into the sea. It failed within hours. The hospital received 200 wounded in a space designed for 40. Worked 36 hours straight, amputating limbs without anesthesia, watching men die from wounds that would have been survivable with proper equipment. The bombs arrived on July 9th. American artillery had been systematic, thorough, reducing defensive positions to crater-marked wasteland. But the hospital, marked with red crosses that should have granted protection under international law, received hits nonetheless, perhaps accidentally. Perhaps because the red crosses had been painted too small to see from bombing altitude. Perhaps because in total war, such distinctions mattered less than they did in Geneva Convention discussions. 40 patients dead, 7 nurses wounded, the building rendered unusable. Helped carry survivors into caves on the island's northern end, natural formations that offered some protection from shells, but turned into ovens under the tropical sun. They had no electricity, no running water, no way to sterilize instruments. She performed surgeries by flashlight, her hands steady, even as her mind screamed at the futility. By July 15th, everyone understood the island was lost. American forces controlled the southern two-thirds. Japanese forces, what remained of them, were compressed into an ever-shrinking pocket of territory. Civilians, thousands of them, faced the same choice the propaganda officer had outlined: surrender to the Americans or die by their own hand. Marpy Point, the northern cliffs where limestone met ocean in a vertical drop of 200 feet, became the site of a tragedy that would haunt for the rest of her life. She watched families gather at the cliff edge, mothers holding children, elderly couples holding hands, young men barely old enough to shave. One by one or in groups, they stepped off into empty air. Some jumped. Some were pushed by Japanese soldiers who considered surrender a greater sin than murder. The sound of bodies hitting rocks below, mixed with the crash of waves and the distant thunder of American artillery. Stood at the cliff edge for 10 minutes, her toes inches from the drop, her mind cycling through the propaganda officer's warnings. The Americans would rape her, torture her, feed her body to dogs. Better to die quickly with dignity than endure what came next. Her hand moved to the razor in her pocket. The blade felt cold against her palm. Her legs refused to jump. Some instinct deeper than propaganda, some animal drive for survival that overrode conscious thought, kept her feet planted on solid ground. When she finally stepped back from the edge, 14 other women stood behind her alive because they too had failed the test of absolute loyalty. Failed or refused. The distinction would matter later. The Japanese soldiers found them that evening, hiding in a cave, still breathing. The beating started immediately. Rifle butts against ribs, boots against backs, open-handed slaps that split lips and loosened teeth. You dishonor the emperor. You disgrace your families. You choose life like cowards when death would prove your worth. The soldier who kicked in the lower back, his boot connecting with her spine, in a blow that would have consequences 3 days later, spat on her afterward. You are already dead, he said. The Americans will just finish what you were too weak to do yourself. When the beating ended, 15 women lay on cave floor, bruised and bleeding and alive. The soldiers left them there, moving to defensive positions for a last stand that everyone knew would end in their deaths. Touched her split lip, tasted copper, felt the deep ache in her spine where the kick had landed. Around her, women wept quietly, not from pain, from shame. They had been taught that life without honor was worthless. Now they had chosen life, and the cost was being beaten by their own countrymen. The Americans arrived the next morning, August 13th, not with bayonets and rage as the propaganda had promised. With loudspeakers broadcasting messages in Japanese, offering surrender terms guaranteeing safety under the Geneva Convention. Ko and the 14 women emerged from the cave with hands raised, expecting bullets, receiving instead the confused expressions of young soldiers who seemed uncertain what to do with female prisoners. A lieutenant barely older than Ko spoke into a radio while gesturing for the women to sit. They sat. They waited. No one shot them. The first small crack in the propaganda's armor. They were given water, not thrown at them, handed to them in metal canteens, clean water that tasted of minerals and hope. They were given hard biscuits that were dry and flavorless, but were food which was more than they had eaten in 48 hours. They were loaded into a truck, 2 soldiers as escorts, and driven toward what Ko assumed would be a detention camp. The soldiers did not speak to them, did not touch them, did not in any way behave like the monsters they were supposed to be. The second crack widened. Day 1 of the march began on August 14th early morning, when heat was still bearable, and the road stretched ahead like a sentence whose length remained unknown. 15 women walked in a line between 4 American soldiers, 2 ahead and 2 behind, rifles present but not pointed. The landscape told stories of violence, recent and complete. Destroyed tanks sat in fields, their metal twisted by explosives. Palm trees stood as blackened stumps. Craters filled with rainwater reflected clouds moving overhead. The air carried smells. Ko wished she could forget burnt metal, decomposing, flesh cordite smoke. They walked 12 miles that first day. Wooden sandals that had already been falling apart disintegrated further with each step. Some women went barefoot, their feet bleeding on rough road surface. The heat climbed past 90 degrees, then past 95, pressing down like a physical weight. Sweat soaked through clothing already filthy from days in caves. Dust rose with each footfall, coating throats, causing coughing fits that slowed the line and drew impatient glances from the escorts. No one offered to help them, but no one beat them either. The absence of violence created its own kind of tension, awaiting for the other shoe to drop for the Americans to reveal their true nature. Every time the column stopped, women exchanged whispers. When will they do it? When will the kindness end and the brutality begin? Maybe tonight. Maybe when we reach wherever they are taking us. Maybe they are waiting until there are more soldiers to participate. The psychological torture of anticipation exceeded any physical hardship the march imposed. Night brought a different fear. The soldiers set up a basic camp beside the road, a perimeter marked by nothing more than their presence. They started a small fire-heated rations, ate without offering food to the prisoners. Ko's stomach cramped with hunger that went beyond physical need into something more primal. She had not eaten a proper meal in 4 days. The hard biscuits from that morning felt like a memory from another lifetime. Then the red-haired soldier approached the one who had been walking at the front of the column. He carried his canteen and a small package wrapped in wax paper. Ko tensed every muscle, preparing for whatever came next. He held out the canteen. She stared at it, unable to process the gesture. His expression showed no malice, no triumph, just exhaustion, and something that might have been pity. Take it, his eyes seemed to say. You need this. Ko took the canteen, drank water that was cooler than it should have been, that tasted clean and pure and impossible. The soldier unwrapped the wax paper to reveal crackers and a small portion of canned meat. He set it on the ground between them, stepped back, returned to his position. Ko looked at the food, looked at the 14 women watching her, divided the rations into 15 portions, each pathetically small, but each representing something that did not fit the narrative they had been given. Kindness unprompted and apparently genuine from someone who had every reason to hate them. Day 2 brought new challenges. Ko's back began to ache more seriously, the pain from the soldier's kick developing into something deeper and more concerning. Each step sent jolts up her spine. She bit her lip to keep from showing weakness, knowing that any sign of inability to continue could result in being left behind. The other women noticed. Yuki, who had become something like a friend during their time at the hospital, walked close enough to catch Ko if she stumbled. The landscape gradually changed as they moved inland. Destroyed villages gave way to areas where American forces had established control. Ko saw things that made no sense according to everything she had been taught. Warehouses constructed from metal, huge structures that gleamed under the sun, built in the weeks since invasion began. Supply dumps with stacks of crates taller than houses. Trucks moving in organized convoys, dozens of them, carrying materials whose purpose she could only guess. The scale spoke of resources that seemed impossible and industrial capacity that dwarfed anything she had seen in Japanese military operations. One moment stayed with her. They passed an American field kitchen, open-sided tent, where cooks prepared food for soldiers. The smell of cooking meat made Ko's mouth water involuntarily. But what struck her was not the food itself. It was the amount being thrown away. A cook scraped an entire tray of scrambled eggs into a waste bin. Scrambled eggs. Protein, nutrition, discarded as if it were nothing, as if more existed than could possibly be consumed. Ko thought of her family in Tokyo, where her mother's last letter had mentioned eating grass soup to stretch the rice rations. Her brother had died of tuberculosis in March because medicine was unavailable. Her father had lost 30 pounds, his body consuming itself for lack of adequate food. And here, enemy soldiers threw away eggs because they were too cold to be palatable. The cognitive dissonance created a headache worse than physical exhaustion. They walked another 12 miles that second day. Ko's spine protested each step with increasing volume. By evening, the pain had localized to a specific point in her lower back, a hot burning that suggested damage more serious than bruising. She lay on the ground that night, unable to find a position that offered relief, listening to the other women breathe and wondering how much longer her body would cooperate. Day 3 began badly and deteriorated from there. Ko's legs felt wrong from the moment she stood, a numbness creeping into her thighs that terrified her more than pain would have. She stumbled twice in the first hour. Yuki caught her arm, both times steadying her, whispering encouragement that felt hollow against the evidence Ko's body provided. Something was seriously wrong. Something was getting worse. The disc between her third and fourth lumbar vertebrae, damaged by the soldier's kick, was herniating. The herniated material was compressing her spinal cord. The nerves that controlled her legs were dying cell by cell, with each step she forced herself to take. She had perhaps 6 hours before the damage became permanent. Ko did not know this medical detail. She only knew that her legs were becoming less responsive, that the numbness was spreading, that terror was replacing pain as her primary sensation. She had to keep walking, had to keep moving, because stopping meant being left behind, and being left behind meant dying alone on a road in territory controlled by an enemy she still did not fully understand. The heat that third day exceeded anything from the previous two. 100 degrees by 10 in the morning. The road surface absorbed solar radiation and threw it back as visible waves of distortion. Ko's vision began to blur at the edges, whether from heat or from her body's distress signals, she could not determine. Her mouth tasted of copper and dust. Her heart raced, trying to compensate for systems that were failing in ways she could feel but not articulate. 2:47 in the afternoon. The moment arrived without warning, without dramatic buildup, just a sudden and complete failure of her legs to obey commands from her brain. One step normal, the next step nothing. Her knees buckled. She fell forward. Her hands hit the dirt road. Dust rose around her in a cloud that caught afternoon sunlight. The scream came from somewhere deep in her chest animal and terrified the sound of a body realizing it was broken beyond its ability to repair. The pain in her spine peaked a crescendo of agony that whited out thought. But worse than the pain was the absence beneath it. She could see her legs, could watch them, lying motionless on the ground, but could not feel them, could not move them, could not make them respond no matter how hard she tried. The disconnect between seeing and feeling created a vertigo more disorienting than any physical sensation. 14 women stopped walking. Yuki dropped to her knees beside Ko, hands hovering, uncertain where to touch without causing more pain. Ko, what is wrong? Can you stand? Ko tried to answer, tried to explain, but the words came out as gasps. I cannot move them. I cannot feel my legs. The practical nurse, part of her brain still functioning, despite everything, understood what this meant. Spinal cord compression. Paralysis, without intervention permanent. With intervention, maybe survival? Maybe. The American soldiers had stopped two standing several feet away, their young faces showing confusion rather than hostility. One of them, the tall soldier with red hair, who had given Ko water the previous day, called something in English. His tone suggested concern rather than anger, a question rather than a command. He pulled a radio handset from his shoulder. Webbing spoke quickly into it, his eyes moving from Ko to the women surrounding her and back. The other women formed a protective circle, instinct overriding logic. Ko was helpless on the ground. The Americans were still technically the enemy. Everything they had been taught said that enemy soldiers would kill the wounded, that showing weakness invited violence. Sachiko, the former teacher, whose English was better than the others, stood and faced the soldiers. Her hands raised in a gesture meant to transcend language. Please wait. Please help. She pointed at Ko, then made a gesture like someone unable to walk. The red-haired soldier looked at his companion, a shorter man with corporal stripes who shook his head slowly, as if this situation exceeded his training. The taller soldier spoke into the radio again, more urgent this time, describing what he was seeing to someone who could make decisions about what happened next. Ko lay on the ground, feeling her heart pound, feeling pain pulse in her spine, feeling nothing at all from her waist down. Her mind cycled through possibilities, none of them good. They would shoot her to end her suffering. They would leave her for dead. They would do what the propaganda promised they would do. Minutes passed. Each one felt longer than the one before. Yuki cradled Ko's head using the edge of her filthy dress to wipe dust from Ko's face. Other women tried to straighten Ko's legs, but the slightest movement sent fresh bolts of agony through her back, causing screams that made them stop. Do not move me, Ko begged. Please, it hurts too much. They did not move her. They simply waited, surrounding her, protecting her from threats they expected, but could not see. The whispers started questions with no good answers. What will they do to her? She cannot walk. Will they shoot her? Maybe they will leave her here. We should prepare ourselves. Maybe they will do worse. The propaganda had been specific about worse, detailed about worse, creative about worse. And now Ko was vulnerable, helpless, at the mercy of soldiers they had been taught showed no mercy. Then the sound of an engine approached, growing louder, a vehicle moving fast. Ko turned her head, saw dust rising in the distance, a jeep coming toward them at speed. This was it. Whatever was going to happen would happen now. The jeep skidded to a stop 20 feet away, tires throwing gravel. Two men jumped out, but they were not regular soldiers. Different uniforms. White armbands with red crosses, medical personnel, army medics. The first medic was young, maybe 25, with dark hair, and a face that carried the kind of seriousness that came from seeing too much death too young. The second was older, gray at his temples, wearing glasses that reflected the sun. They carried bags over their shoulders and moved with practiced urgency that suggested this was not their first medical emergency in a war zone. They walked quickly toward the group of women, and the Japanese prisoners instinctively moved back their protective circle, widening to let the Americans approach, but maintaining presence as if proximity could somehow protect Ko from whatever came next. The young medic held up his hands, palms out, a gesture of peace that transcended language barriers. He said something in English, his voice calm and steady, the tone carrying reassurance even though the words meant nothing to Ko's ears. He pointed at Ko, then at his medical bag, then made a gesture of examining someone. Sachiko understood before the others. He wanted to look at Ko, to help her or to determine if she was worth saving or to do something that Sachiko's English was not sufficient to predict. The women looked at each other, communicating in glances what they could not speak aloud. They had no choice. Refusing would not protect Ko. The Americans had guns, had authority, had every advantage. Slowly, reluctantly, they parted, creating space for the medics to approach. Ko watched them come, every nerve that still functioned, screaming warnings her body was too exhausted to heed. The young medic knelt beside Ko on the dusty road. He set his bag down, opened it with practiced efficiency, revealing contents that Ko's nurse training allowed her to identify despite her fear. Bandages, bottles of clear liquid, instruments in sterile packaging, syringes, morphine vials, real medical supplies, not the scraps they had been working with at the hospital. He looked at Ko's face, at her tears, and his expression softened into something Ko had not expected. Compassion, genuine human compassion. Then he smiled, not a cruel smile, not a mocking smile meant to hurt before causing pain. A kind smile, the kind you give to someone who is suffering, to tell them they are not alone, that help has arrived, that the worst might be over. Ko stared at him through her tears, confusion and fear, and desperate hope mixing into something that hurt worse than her spine. This was not what she had been taught to expect. This was not the monster from propaganda warnings. This was a tired young man with medical training trying to help someone in pain. And that realization, more than anything else that had happened in the past 3 days, shattered the first major piece of the wall Ko had built around what she believed about the war. I'll craft a narrative centered on the medical intervention, exploring the intricate moments of human connection through the lens of emergency medical care. The focus will be on the delicate process of assessment, treatment, and the subtle transformation that occurs when compassion transcends conflict. The medic's hands moved with efficiency, born from hundreds of similar assessments in conditions far worse than a dusty road under afternoon sun. He checked Ko's pulse, first fingers pressing against her wrist, counting beats that came too fast, a heart working overtime to compensate for trauma it could not repair through circulation alone. 140 beats per minute. His face tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that spoke volumes to anyone trained to read medical concern. He pulled a small flashlight from his bag, clicked it on, lifted Ko's eyelids one at a time to examine pupil response. Dilated. Shock setting in, the body's automatic response to catastrophic injury, flooding the system with stress hormones. He spoke to his partner, the older medic with the gray hair and rapid English that carried the cadence of medical professionals exchanging clinical observations. Ko caught none of the words but understood the tone. Serious, complicated, urgent. The young medic gestured toward Ko's spine, asking a question she could not understand. Where does it hurt? Show me where the pain is worst. Ko pointed to her lower back, the specific spot where fire seemed to originate and spread. My back, my legs, I cannot feel them. She spoke in Japanese, knowing he would not comprehend, but needing to communicate somehow to make him understand that time was a factor she could feel slipping away with each numb second. His touch, when it came, was gentle in a way that shocked her more than rough handling would have. Fingers probed along her spine, careful and professional, seeking the source of damage through external palpation. When he reached the injured area, Ko screamed despite his care. The sound echoed off surrounding hills, a raw expression of agony that made several watching women flinch. He withdrew his hand, immediately murmured something that sounded like an apology, though. Ko's understanding of English extended only to a handful of military terms learned from treating wounded soldiers who had faced American forces. He is sorry. The thought cut through pain and fear. He hurt me by accident while trying to assess injury, and he apologized. Enemy soldiers do not apologize to prisoners. Monsters do not feel regret for causing pain during medical examination. The older medic joined his partner, and together they conducted a more thorough evaluation. They tested reflexes in Ko's legs, tapping knees that should have jerked but remained still. They ran the edge of a tongue depressor along the soles of her feet, watching for reactions that did not come. They pressed fingernails into her calves, observing her face for signs of sensation Ko could not provide because the signals were not reaching her brain. The two men exchanged looks that conveyed professional assessment, arriving at the same conclusion from different angles of observation. Herniated disc with complete spinal cord compression, immediate surgical intervention required, or permanent paralysis guaranteed. Ko did not know these specific medical terms. She knew only that their faces had grown more serious, that their conversation had become more urgent, that the younger medic was now looking at the red-haired soldier and speaking in a tone that suggested orders rather than requests. The soldier nodded, spoke into his radio with new urgency, used words Ko recognized from context if not meaning. Emergency, medical, now. The young medic turned back to Ko, and what he did next would replay in her memory for decades afterward. He opened his medical bag, fully letting Ko see inside, demonstrating transparency, as if to prove he was not reaching for a weapon or poison or anything designed to harm. His hand emerged holding a small glass vial filled with clear liquid and a syringe still in sterile packaging. He held both items where Ko could see them clearly, where the other women could witness what he intended to do. Morphine. Sachiko's voice came from behind Ko, barely above a whisper. That is morphine. The teacher-turned-nurse had seen enough medical procedures to recognize military-grade pain medication when presented with it. He is going to give her morphine. The panic that rippled through the watching women was palpable. Micho spoke what others were thinking in a hiss meant only for those who shared her language. Poison. It must be poison. Why else would he show it so openly? They want us to watch her die. Yuki's grip on Ko's head tightened protectively. No, they would not bring medicine here just to poison one prisoner. It makes no tactical sense. The medic seemed to understand their distress despite the language barrier. He pointed at the vial, then at Ko's arm, then made an injection gesture, followed by a sleeping motion with his hands pressed together against his tilted head. This will help the pain. This will make you rest, trust me. His eyes, brown and earnest and tired from too many wounded soldiers in too many battles, held Ko's gaze as if willing her to believe what his words could not convey. Ko looked at Yuki, who still cradled her head. Yuki's face showed fear and uncertainty and desperate hope mixed together. What choice do they have? What choice did any of them have? Ko held out her arm, skin pale against the dirt veins visible beneath tissue, depleted by weeks of inadequate nutrition. If this was poison, death would come quickly. If it was truly morphine, perhaps the pain would ease long enough for her to think clearly about what came next. The medic swabbed her arm with alcohol, the sharp chemical smell cutting through road dust and sweat. He tore open the syringe package with practiced efficiency, drew liquid from the vial with steady hands, flicked the syringe to remove air bubbles, depressed the plunger slightly until a drop of morphine appeared at the needle tip. 10 milligrams of pharmaceutical-grade pain relief worth more on the black market than 3 months of a factory worker's salary in Tokyo. He was about to inject it into an enemy prisoner who could provide no intelligence, no tactical advantage, no benefit to American military objectives. The needle pierced skin. Ko tensed, despite herself expecting pain, receiving instead only the brief sharp sensation of penetration. The medic depressed the plunger, slowly allowing the morphine to enter her bloodstream at a controlled rate, watching her face for adverse reactions that indicated allergy or overdose. When the syringe emptied, he withdrew the needle, pressed a small square of gauze over the injection site, held pressure for 10 seconds before releasing. Then came the wait. Ko had administered morphine often enough to know it did not work instantly, that the drug needed time to circulate, to cross barriers, to bind with receptors that would translate chemical compounds into blessed relief. 30 seconds felt like 30 minutes. Her breathing remained shallow and rapid. Her heart continued its panicked rhythm. Pain still radiated from her spine in waves that made her vision blur. But at 45 seconds, something shifted. The edges of the pain began to soften, sharp agony dulling to something more manageable. At 60 seconds, Ko's hands unclenched fingers that had been digging into dirt, relaxing against her will. At 90 seconds, her breathing slowed, deepened, found a rhythm that suggested her body was no longer in pure survival mode. The morphine was working, dulling signals that had been overwhelming her nervous system, creating space between sensation and suffering. Ko's face changed. The tears continued, but from relief now, rather than agony. For the first time in 3 days, pain was not the dominant fact of her existence. She could think. She could process. She could recognize that the American medic who had just administered expensive narcotics to an enemy prisoner was now wiping sweat from her forehead with a clean cloth pulled from his aid kit. Why, the question formed in Ko's mind, but could not find voice. Why would you do this? Why would you waste medicine on someone whose country tried to kill you? Why would you show kindness to a woman you were trained to see as enemy, as other, as less than human? The medic had no answer because he could not hear the question. He simply continued his work, checking Ko's pulse again, to monitor how her body responded to the narcotic, observing her pupils for signs of respiratory depression, maintaining professional vigilance while showing personal care. He spoke to her in English, his voice low and gentle, and though Ko understood nothing of the literal meaning, the tone communicated everything that mattered. You are going to be okay. We are taking care of you. You are not alone. Around them, 14 women watched this interaction with expressions ranging from confusion to wonder to the first tentative stirrings of cognitive dissonance. Their own soldiers had beaten them for failing to commit suicide. This enemy soldier was providing comfort with a tenderness reserved in their experience for family or closest friends. The contrast was too stark to ignore, too significant to dismiss as aberration or tactical manipulation. Another vehicle approached, larger than the jeep, an ambulance marked with red crosses that matched the armbands the medics wore. It pulled up, close rear doors opening to reveal a stretcher secured to an interior rack, an equipment Ko recognized from her nursing training. Proper medical transport, not a truck bed, not rough handling. A vehicle designed specifically to move injured patients with minimal additional trauma. 2 more medics climbed out, bringing the total to 4 Americans, now surrounding one paralyzed Japanese nurse. The older medic, the one with gray hair and captain's insignia, Ko now noticed on his collar, spoke to the newcomers with hand gestures that supplemented his English. He pointed at Ko's spine, made a gesture indicating compression, showed with his hands how the herniation was affecting nerve function. The others nodded, understanding, immediately preparing for patient transfer with a level of coordination that spoke to extensive training and recent practice. This was the moment that truly shocked the watching women. The medics did not simply grab Ko and throw her onto the stretcher as one might handle cargo or livestock. They worked with meticulous care that bordered on reverence. The captain explained something to his team, making gestures about spinal precautions, about maintaining alignment, about the critical importance of not causing additional injury during movement. They positioned the stretcher on the ground beside Ko, taking time to ensure it was level and stable. Then they produced a backboard, rigid plastic designed to immobilize the spine during transport. Working in synchronized coordination developed through repetition, they rolled Ko slightly onto her side while one medic slid the board beneath her. The movement caused pain, even through the morphine haze, and Ko gasped. They stopped immediately, waiting until her breathing stabilized before continuing. When they lowered her onto the board, they did so in increments, one medic supporting her head, another supporting her shoulders, a third supporting her hips, the fourth supporting her legs. 4 grown men treating a single wounded woman as if she were constructed from crystal rather than flesh and bone. They secured her to the board with straps, careful not to cinch them tight enough to restrict breathing or circulation. They placed rolled towels on either side of her head, creating cushioning that would prevent lateral movement during transport. They covered her with a clean blanket, despite the heat, maintaining dignity and preventing shock. Every action demonstrated training and care that exceeded anything required by military protocol for handling enemy prisoners. The captain knelt beside Ko one more time, making eye contact as he spoke. His English remained incomprehensible, but his meaning transcended language. "We are going to lift you now. We will be careful. You are safe with us." Ko found herself nodding, acknowledging words she could not understand, but whose intent was clear through every nonverbal cue he provided. 4 medics lifted the backboard, rising from crouches with coordinated effort that distributed weight evenly and prevented sudden movements. They carried Ko toward the ambulance, their steps synchronized, moving slowly despite obvious urgency. She felt stable despite being suspended between 4 sets of hands, felt secure despite being completely helpless, felt cared for despite being enemy and prisoner in wounded burden who could provide nothing in return for this treatment. They slid the backboard onto the stretcher rack inside the ambulance, secured it with mechanical clicks that locked it in place. The young medic who had first examined Ko climbed in beside her, settling onto a small, fold-down seat, positioning himself where he could monitor her condition during transport. He checked her pulse again, the repetitive assessment becoming almost comforting in its consistency. He adjusted her blanket. He offered what might have been reassurance in words she still could not parse, but appreciated nonetheless. Before they closed the ambulance doors, the captain turned to face the 14 women still standing by the roadside. He pointed at them, then at himself, then made a following gesture. He was telling them something, offering something, making some kind of decision that affected their immediate future. The red-haired soldier, who had been part of their original escort, spoke to another soldier who had arrived with the ambulance convoy. A brief discussion ensued, ending with the second soldier waving toward a regular transport truck parked behind the ambulance. He was gesturing for the women to board the truck. They would be allowed to come, to stay with Ko, to not be separated from their friend who might be dying or might be saved depending on what these Americans chose to do in the hours ahead. Sachiko understood first, gasping slightly before translating for others. They are letting us go with her, to wherever they take her. We will not be separated. The decision violated standard operating procedure for handling prisoners of war. Efficiency dictated sending the mobile prisoner to medical facilities while routing the others to detention camps designed for civilians. Separating them made logistical sense, freed up transport, simplified processing. But the captain had looked at 15 women who had clearly bonded through shared trauma, had seen how they protected. Ko had recognized that sometimes human compassion mattered more than procedural efficiency. Sachiko made the choice for all of them. She walked toward the truck slowly, at first testing whether this offer was genuine or trap. When no one stopped her, when the soldier simply stood aside and gestured toward the truck bed, she climbed in. One by one, the others followed. They sat on hard wooden benches lining the sides, holding onto canvas supports as the engine started. Through the open back, they could see the ambulance ahead of them, could imagine Ko inside receiving care. They had been taught enemy forces would never provide to Japanese prisoners. The convoy began moving. Ambulance first, then the truck carrying 14 women, then a jeep with armed soldiers following behind for security. The road unwound beneath them, leading away from battlefields and toward American-controlled territory where infrastructure had already been established with speed that defied belief for anyone who had witnessed Japanese military logistics struggling to maintain supply lines even before the island fell. Ko inside the ambulance drifted between full consciousness and morphine-induced haze. She could hear the engine feel vibrations through the stretcher, sense the medic beside her maintaining vigilant watch. Her legs remained numb, dead weight attached to a body that was otherwise responding to pharmaceutical intervention. The pain in her spine had receded to distant thunder rather than immediate lightning. She existed in a strange liminal space between emergency and aftermath, between trauma and treatment, between what she had believed about her enemy and what she was experiencing in real time. The medic spoke to her periodically, his voice becoming familiar, even without comprehension. He checked her pulse every few minutes, his fingers warm against her wrist, his touch gentle and professional. He dampened a cloth with water from a canteen and wiped her face, removing dust and sweat with careful strokes. He adjusted her blanket when it shifted, tucked it around her shoulders, maintained her comfort as if this were his only concern, rather than one task among hundreds in a war zone that demanded constant triage of competing priorities. 20 minutes into the journey, Ko noticed changes in the sounds filtering into the ambulance. American voices became more frequent, speaking English in casual tones rather than the clipped military communication she associated with combat operations. Engines ran in steady rhythms, suggesting idling vehicles rather than tactical movement. The whole auditory landscape shifted from battlefield to base camp, from chaos to something approaching order. The ambulance slowed, then stopped. The rear doors opened, flooding the interior with bright afternoon light that made Ko squint despite her exhausted state. The medic unfastened the stretcher from its rack, and suddenly there were hands everywhere. Americans in medical uniforms lifting her, carrying her, moving with practiced efficiency, born from processing thousands of wounded soldiers in the months since invasion forces had landed on Saipan's beaches. Ko glimpsed her surroundings in fragments as she was carried. Large tents with red crosses painted on their canvas sides. Wounded American soldiers on gurneys, some with bandaged heads, some with splinted limbs, some with the 1,000-yard stares that suggested psychological injuries exceeded physical ones. Doctors and nurses moving between patients, calling orders, conducting triage with speed that came from too much recent practice. An American flag hanging from a tall pole fabric, snapping in the breeze, red and white stripes, and white stars on blue background, that represented everything Ko had been taught to hate. She was carried into one of the tents, the temperature immediately dropping by several degrees in the shade provided by thick canvas. The tent interior smelled of antiseptic and blood, and something else, something Ko's nose identified as cleanliness. Actual sterile cleanliness, rather than the desperate attempts at hygiene that had characterized the Japanese military hospital where she had worked. Overhead lights ran from generators she could hear rumbling outside, providing illumination that would continue after sunset, after dark, throughout the night if necessary. They transferred her onto an examination table, the captain who had first assessed her on the road now taking charge with authority that made others move to follow his lead. He spoke rapidly in English, gesturing toward Ko's spine, describing what he had found and what he suspected needed to happen. Another doctor joined him, this one older still, with colonel's eagles on his shoulders and gray eyebrows that suggested decades of medical experience preceding this particular war. Ko watched them examine her, feeling detached from the proceedings, as if she were observer rather than patient. The morphine created distance between her consciousness and her body, allowing her to note with clinical interest that they were conducting a neurological assessment, testing reflexes, checking sensation, mapping the extent of damage with thorough professionalism. The colonel spoke, his tone serious, and the captain nodded. They conversed at length, both examining Ko's back, both palpating the injured area with careful pressure that still caused pain fierce enough to break through pharmaceutical barriers. Then the colonel stepped back, removed his glasses, cleaned them with a cloth pulled from his pocket, replaced them, and spoke with finality that suggested decision rather than discussion. The captain's face showed relief mixed with concern, an expression Ko recognized from her own experience, telling families that surgery was necessary but risky. They were going to operate. They were going to attempt to repair her spine to decompress the herniated disc to try to save her ability to walk. While the question rose again in Ko's morphine-clouded mind. She was enemy. She was prisoner. She was Japanese nurse who would never again serve in military capacity even if surgery succeeded. She represented negative value from purely tactical perspective, resource drain without strategic benefit. Every logical calculation suggested letting her die, or stabilizing her for prisoner exchange, or providing minimal care that would keep her alive without investing significant time or expensive supplies in uncertain surgical outcome. But these Americans were not operating from logic that prioritized efficiency over humanity. The colonel issued more orders. Nurses moved to obey the examination area, transformed into preparation space for surgery that would happen soon, perhaps within the hour, certainly before the day ended. Ko would go under anesthesia not knowing if she would wake with functioning legs or permanent paralysis or possibly not wake at all. Surgery carried risks, especially spinal surgery, especially in field conditions, especially for patients already compromised by days of inadequate nutrition and high stress. A nurse approached younger than Ko, with brown hair, pulled back, and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. She held a syringe larger than the one used for morphine containing general anesthetic that would induce unconsciousness deep enough for surgeons to cut into Ko's back and manipulate her spine without patient awareness. The nurse spoke in English, her voice gentle, explaining what Ko could not understand but could intuit from context. "This will make you sleep. When you wake, the surgery will be finished. We will take care of you." Outside the medical tent, in a smaller tent designated for overflow or non-critical patients, or in this case 14 Japanese women who had been allowed to accompany their wounded friend, the others waited with tension that made breathing difficult. They had been given water immediately upon arrival. Clean water in metal cups, unlimited quantity offered by a nurse who seemed genuinely confused when they hesitated before drinking as if they suspected poisoning or rationing or some catch that would reveal itself after consumption. Then the nurse had brought food. She carried a wooden crate filled with cans and packages, setting it on a makeshift table before opening containers to show contents. Canned meat pink and glistening in its own juices. Crackers that looked fresh rather than stale. Canned fruit peaches swimming in syrup that smelled of summer and abundance. Chocolate bars wrapped in paper printed with English words none of them could read but whose purpose was unmistakable. She arranged everything as if setting out a feast, then gestured for them to eat, her expression, welcoming, her body language, encouraging. The women stared at the food with expressions that mixed hunger and disbelief. It was more than they had seen in a month, more than some had seen in a year. Toward the end of the battle for Saipan, rations had been reduced to rice mixed with dirt to extend supplies supplemented by whatever could be foraged from jungle that was increasingly devastated by artillery. They had eaten leaves-bark insects when hunger became desperate enough to overcome revulsion. And now an enemy nurse was offering them canned ham and chocolate as if these were normal provisions, rather than luxuries beyond imagining. Yuki reached for a cracker first, her hand trembling slightly as she picked it up, half expecting someone to slap it away or demand payment or reveal that this apparent generosity was actually test or trap. She bit into it carefully, her eyes widening as flavor registered. It was real, actual food, not rotten, not moldy, not mixed with sawdust or contaminated with mold or any of the compromises they had learned to accept. The cracker tasted of wheat and salt and normalcy from a world they had almost forgotten existed. The others followed, reaching for food with tentative movements that gradually became more confident as no one stopped them. No one punished them, no one suggested this was anything other than what it appeared to be. They ate slowly, carefully, as if speed might break the spell. Some cried while eating, tears mixing with food in their mouths, emotion overwhelming them, as bodies long denied adequate nutrition received sudden abundance. Micho held a chocolate bar, turning it over in her hands, reading English words that meant nothing but looking at the paper as if it might explain why enemies were feeding prisoners food that was better, richer, more carefully produced than anything available to Japanese civilians in Tokyo. She unwrapped one corner, broke off a small piece, placed it on her tongue. The chocolate melted sweet and rich, a taste of peacetime luxury in the middle of war. She sobbed quietly, clutching the rest of the bar to her chest. The nurse watched them eat with an expression that suggested sadness, rather than judgment, pity rather than contempt. She said something in English, her tone sympathetic, her eyes reflecting understanding that needed no translation. I am sorry you were so hungry. I am sorry this happened to you. Then she left, returning to her duties with wounded soldiers who needed attention, leaving the crate of food behind as if it were nothing, as if more existed than could possibly be consumed, as if abundance was default rather than exception. The women sat in silence after eating, processing experiences that contradicted everything they had been taught to expect from American forces. They had been beaten by their own soldiers for refusing to die. They had been fed by enemy soldiers who owed them nothing. The inversion was too complete, too undeniable to dismiss as anomaly or propaganda in reverse. Something fundamental in their understanding of the war, of their enemy, of themselves, was fracturing under the weight of accumulated evidence. Through the tent opening, they could see the larger medical tent where Coe had been taken. Activity visible through canvas that was not quite opaque suggested procedures underway. Surgery, perhaps intervention, certainly. They could only wait, could only hope, could only reckon with the reality that their friend's survival now depended entirely on the skill and willingness of American doctors to save a life that held no tactical value to their military objectives. Surgery lasted 3 hours and 47 minutes, a duration the 14 women could only track by watching shadows move across tent canvas as afternoon gave way to evening. No one came to update them. No one explained what was happening beyond that canvas barrier, separating them from their friend who might be dying under American scalpels. They sat in silence, punctuated by occasional whispers, each woman alone with thoughts that spiraled through fear and hope, and confusion about why enemy doctors would invest hours trying to save one paralyzed prisoner. Lieutenant Sarah Anderson, the nurse who had brought them food, returned as the sun touched the horizon. Her uniform showed bloodstains on the sleeves, evidence of long hours in surgical assistance, but her face carried something that looked like cautious optimism. She stood in the tent entrance, waiting until all eyes focused on her before speaking words they could not understand but delivering them with body language that transcended linguistic barriers. She made a gesture like someone lying down, then sitting up, then gave a thumbs-up signal. Successful. The surgery was successful. Sachiko understood first, the former teacher, whose English extended far enough to recognize positive indicators even without catching specific vocabulary. She gasped, translated for the others in rapid Japanese that carried relief like a flood breaking through weakened dam. Ko is alive. The surgery worked. She will walk again. The tent erupted in controlled chaos, women crying and embracing and releasing tension that had been building since the moment Ko collapsed on that dusty road. Anderson smiled at their reaction, her exhaustion visible, but eclipsed by satisfaction that came from delivering good news to people who had clearly expected the worst. She gestured for them to follow, leading them across the compound toward a different tent, smaller and quieter, where patients who had survived critical procedures were moved for recovery and monitoring. Inside, under lights powered by generators that created steady illumination untouched by sunset, Ko lay on a real bed with clean white sheets and a pillow supporting her head at an angle that suggested someone had considered her comfort rather than merely her survival. Ko was conscious but heavily sedated, her eyes half open and struggling to focus, her face pale against white linen. A thin tube ran from her arm to an intravenous drip hanging from a metal stand, delivering fluids and possibly antibiotics into her bloodstream. Bandages wrapped her lower back, thick gauze covering surgical incisions that had been closed with stitches, careful enough to minimize scarring. Her legs lay motionless beneath a light blanket, and for a heart-stopping moment, Yuki thought the surgery had failed, that Ko would remain paralyzed despite American intervention. Then Ko's right foot moved. Just a twitch, barely perceptible, but movement where there had been none before. Ko's eyes found Yuki's face, recognition dawning slowly through pharmaceutical fog. "You are here," she whispered, her voice weak but present. "You are really here." Yuki rushed to her side, taking Ko's hand carefully to avoid disturbing the IV line. "We are here. We are all safe. How do you feel? Tired?" Ko admitted what was obvious from every exhausted line of her body. "Confused. They fixed my back. The American doctors. They did surgery on my spine." She looked down at her legs with an expression mixing wonder and disbelief. I can feel them again. I can wiggle my toes. Look. She demonstrated her toes shifting beneath the blanket in movements small but miraculous given that 6 hours earlier, she had been completely paralyzed from the waist down. Sachiko felt tears on her own cheeks watching this display. That is wonderful, Ko. That is incredible. But even as she spoke reassurance, her mind was processing implications that went beyond one successful surgery. She looked around the recovery tent, saw other patients in nearby beds, all Americans, all soldiers wounded in battle against Japanese forces. Some were sleeping. Others were reading magazines or letters from home. One was writing on a notepad balanced on his lap. Another was being tended by a nurse who adjusted his bandages with the same gentle efficiency she had probably shown Ko. They are treating me the same as them. Ko's voice interrupted Sachiko's observations, as if Ko had been tracking her gaze and reading her thoughts. The same medicine, the same care. I do not understand. We are the enemy. We are Japanese. Why would they save me? The question hung in the air unanswerable, not because it lacked response, but because the response required dismantling worldviews built over years of propaganda and cultural conditioning. Maybe everything we were told was a lie. Sachiko spoke the thought that had been forming since the moment medics ran toward Ko instead of past her. The words felt dangerous even in their own language, even surrounded by women who shared the experience that prompted such heresy. Maybe the real monsters were the ones who told us to jump from cliffs. The days that followed established patterns that would define the next 3 months of their captivity. The women were moved to a different section of the compound, an area designated for civilian detainees that was separated from military prisoner facilities by both distance and treatment protocols. They were given a tent with cots, actual mattresses, thin but present blankets that were clean and warm, despite tropical climate making them largely unnecessary. They were issued clothing to replace the torn and filthy dresses they had worn since surrender, simple cotton shifts in neutral colors that fit poorly but were whole and recently laundered. Most shocking was the shower facility. Hot water flowed from pipes connected to tanks, heated by the same generators that powered surgical lights, and refrigeration units keeping medicine viable in tropical heat. Soap was provided rectangular bars that smelled of flowers, rather than the harsh, lye-based military soap they remembered. Towels hung on hooks, white fabric that would show us every stain, and yet was given to them as if cleanliness were default expectation rather than luxury reserved for those with resources to maintain it. Micho stood under hot water for 20 minutes the first time, letting it wash away weeks of accumulated grime and fear and shame. She cried while bathing, mourning and celebration mixing into tears that ran down the drain along with dirt that had seemed permanent. The simple act of being clean felt almost obscene, given where she had been 3 days prior, what she had expected from enemy captivity, how far reality had diverged from prophecy. They were given work assignments, though the term felt inadequate for what was actually requested rather than ordered. A sergeant whose job involved coordinating civilian labor asked through a Japanese-American translator if they would be willing to help in the kitchen doing light preparation work like peeling vegetables or washing dishes. Willing. The word itself was revolutionary. Prisoners were not asked for willingness. They were assigned tasks and punished for refusing. But this American sergeant stood with his hat in his hands, his posture suggesting request, rather than command, waiting for their response, as if they had genuine choice in the matter. Sachiko agreed on behalf of the group, less because they wanted to work than because refusing seemed churlish, after everything else they had been given. They reported to the kitchen tent the following morning, expecting harsh conditions and harsh treatment, finding instead an organized operation where American cooks prepared meals for hundreds of soldiers with efficiency that suggested abundance rather than scarcity driving their methods. Ko, still recovering and walking with a cane provided by the medical staff, was assigned lighter duties counting inventory in the supply tent. She spent hours surrounded by crates and boxes stacked floor to ceiling, each marked with English labels she slowly learned to read with help from Sergeant Ken Tanaka, the Nisei translator, whose presence created its own cognitive dissonance. He had been born in Kyoto, raised in Seattle, spoke both languages fluently, wore an American uniform, while his parents were interned in camps that American propaganda carefully did not mention to international observers. He existed as living proof that identity was more complicated than nationality, that loyalty could be chosen rather than assume that Japanese blood did not automatically determine Japanese allegiance. Ko's first shocking discovery came during her second day of inventory work. She was counting boxes of medical supplies, checking quantities against manifests, when she realized that one storage tent contained more morphine than the entire Japanese military hospital on Saipan had possessed during her entire tenure there. Boxes of syringes still sealed in sterile packaging, crates of sulfa drugs used to prevent infection, gallons of plasma for blood transfusions. The abundance was staggering, incomprehensible, obscene when considered against memories of performing amputations without anesthetic, because supplies had run out weeks before the final battle commenced. She mentioned this to Tanaka during a break, her voice carrying confusion she could not hide. There is so much. How do you have so much? Tanaka's expression showed something like sadness mixed with resignation. America is big, he explained in Japanese, more formal than her own dialect. Very big, with factories that run day and night. They make more than they need and send the extra here. The war in Europe and the war here, both supplied by production that never stops. He gestured at the surrounding tents. This is one base, there are hundreds like it, all supplied the same way. Ko tried to process the implications. In Tokyo, her mother's last letter had mentioned waiting in lines for hours to receive rice rations that were barely sufficient to sustain life. Her younger brother had died of tuberculosis in March because streptomycin was unavailable, at any price the drug simply not existing in quantities adequate to treat civilian populations. And here Americans had so much medicine, they stored it in tents where tropical humidity threatened to reduce its effectiveness before it could even be distributed. The disconnect created vertigo worse than any physical sensation. Kitchen duty brought its own revelations for the women assigned there. Yuki watched a cook scrape an entire tray of scrambled eggs into a waste container, explaining through Tanaka that the eggs had gone slightly cold and regulations required serving hot food to maintain morale and prevent illness. An entire tray, 40 eggs by Yuki's count, protein enough to feed her family for a week, discarded as inadequately fresh. She thought of her father, a fisherman before the war, who had written that he was eating seaweed soup mixed with rice and feeling grateful for days when there was enough to have 2 meals instead of 1. Micho witnessed similar waste with bread. Loaves that were baked that morning but had developed hard crust by afternoon were thrown away rather than served. Not moldy, not spoiled, simply not soft enough to meet standards that assumed abundance allowed such discrimination. She carefully set aside 3 loaves during her shift, wrapping them in cloth to take back to the tent, unable to reconcile throwing away food that was still perfectly edible. When the cook noticed he did not reprimand her, he simply nodded in understanding, crossing his face. "You can take it," he said through Tanaka. "We will not need it." The women developed routines over the following weeks: morning assembly for count and task assignment, work details that lasted 4 to 6 hours, afternoon free time when they could rest or write letters or simply sit and process experiences that continued to contradict every expectation. Evening meals taken in a separate area but prepared in the same kitchens that fed American soldiers, the food identical in quality and quantity, as if prisoner status conferred no nutritional penalty. Ko's recovery progressed faster than the American doctors had predicted, her youth and previous health working in her favor, despite weeks of malnutrition preceding her injury. She graduated from cane to walking unaided within 10 days, her gait slightly unsteady but functional. Captain Rodriguez, the surgeon who had operated on her spine, checked her progress weekly with professional satisfaction that seemed to transcend any nationalistic considerations. "You are healing well," he would say through Tanaka, his hands probing her back to assess surgical site integrity. "The swelling is going down. The nerves are regenerating. You should regain full function within 3 months." Ko bowed each time he examined her, the gesture automatic and deeply Japanese, expressing gratitude that English words could not adequately convey. Rodriguez bowed back awkwardly, but sincerely respecting her culture even as he represented everything she had been taught to hate. The exchange became ritual, 2 people from nations at war treating each other with dignity that warfare seemed designed to destroy. Personal connections developed despite language barriers, or perhaps because of them, forcing communication to rely on gesture and expression and shared humanity rather than words that carried cultural baggage. Lieutenant Anderson, the nurse from Tennessee, began teaching Sachiko basic English, during evening hours when duties permitted. This is thank you. This is please. This is I need help. Sachiko repeated phrases carefully, her educator's mind absorbing new language with speed that surprised both women. Anderson showed photographs of her two sons, ages 5 and 7, boys with gap-toothed smiles and scraped knees visible in black and white images. I miss them, she said, her voice carrying ache that needed no translation. I left them to come here, to heal people, even enemies. Sachiko looked at the photograph, seeing not American children, but simply children, small humans who missed their mother while she worked in a war zone thousands of miles from Tennessee. You are good mother, Sachiko managed in broken English. Come here, help people, show boys how to be kind. Anderson's eyes filled with tears. She blinked away quickly, professional composure reasserting itself, but not before Sachiko saw that nurses missed families just like teachers did. That separation hurt regardless of nationality, that maternal love transcended whatever political circumstances had created this war. A wounded soldier provided another moment of connection that would stay with Ko for decades. She was walking past the recovery tent, practicing her gait under Rodriguez's orders to build strength when a voice called out in English. Hey, you walk now. Goodcoat turned to see a young private, maybe 20 years old, sitting up in bed, with his left leg ending in bandages where his knee should have been. He had lost the lower portion of his limb 2 weeks earlier when stepping on a mine, his military career and probably his pre-war plans ending in one explosive moment. Yet he was waving at Ko with genuine enthusiasm, celebrating her recovery as if it were his own. He gestured for her to approach, and Ko did so hesitantly, uncertain whether this was invitation or something more complicated. When she reached his bedside, he held out a chocolate bar, pressing it into her hands despite her protests. Please, he said, making eating gestures. You deserve happy. Ko stared at the chocolate, then at his face, then at his missing leg. This soldier, who would never walk again, was giving her candy to celebrate that she could walk. The compassion made no logical sense in warfare context where enemy suffering should be celebrated rather than mourned. But it made perfect human sense, the kind that existed before nations taught people to hate strangers who spoke different languages. Ko accepted the chocolate with a bow so deep it nearly doubled her over. Thank you, she said in English, one of the few phrases she had learned. Thank you very much. The soldier grinned, gave a thumbs up, returned to reading a letter from home that probably explained to family that he would be coming back different than he left. Ko walked away with chocolate bar clutched in both hands, crying quietly. Understanding, fragmenting under accumulated weight of kindness from sources propaganda had promised, would show only cruelty. October brought the first letters from Japan Communications that arrived through neutral Sweden's Red Cross system, allowing limited contact between prisoners and families. 12 of the 15 women received messages. 3 did not, their families either unable to send communications or dead in circumstances the Red Cross forms did not specify. Yuki's letter came from her parents' ink, slightly smeared as if written hastily or with shaking hands. Beloved daughter, we are joyful. You live though we grieve, you surrendered. Tokyo receives bombs weekly now. Food grows scarcer. Your brother passed from tuberculosis in August. No medicine available despite searching. But we endure for the Emperor's glory. Do not trust Americans regardless of treatment. They will execute prisoners when convenient. Stay strong, maintain honor, die before allowing defilement. Yuki read the letter 3 times each reading, making comprehension more difficult rather than easier. Her brother was dead. Dead from tuberculosis. Dead from lack of streptomycin that Americans stored in tents where Ko counted supplies. Dead because Japan's medical infrastructure could not produce or import sufficient quantities of drugs that American medics administered to enemy prisoners without hesitation. The irony was too cruel to process cleanly. Her family instructed her to expect execution, to prepare for death, to maintain honor through any means necessary. Yet she sat in a tent with a real mattress, having eaten 3 solid meals that day, having showered in hot water that morning, having spent the afternoon peeling potatoes alongside a cook who had made jokes through Tanaka about his terrible Japanese pronunciation. Where was the execution? When would the cruelty begin? How long could treatment, this contradictory to expectations, persist before revealing itself as elaborate, psychological torture preceding some awful revelation? Other letters carried similar themes. Warnings about American brutality. assurances that families would understand if prisoners chose death over continued captivity, reminders that emperor and nation expected sacrifice rather than survival. The disconnect between written warnings and lived reality created cognitive dissonance so severe that several women spent evenings staring at letters as if repeated reading might reconcile contradictions that only deepened with examination. Micho's letter mentioned that her mother was eating grass soup to extend rice rations, the family diet reduced to vegetation and hope. Ko thought of the kitchen waste she had witnessed, the bread thrown away for being slightly hard, the eggs discarded for being insufficiently hot. American cooks disposed of more food each day than Micho's family consumed in a week. The math was simple and devastating. One nation's garbage exceeded another nation's survival rations. The implications suggested disparities too vast to bridge through military victory alone. The evening after letters arrived, tension in the women's tent reached levels that demanded confrontation. They sat in a circle, 15 women who had shared caves and beatings and now shared captivity that felt less like imprisonment than like protection from war still raging beyond compound fences. One woman, older and more rigid in her convictions, spoke what others were thinking, but hesitating to voice. We are being manipulated. This treatment is designed to break our spirits, to make us traitors who will speak against Japan when the war ends. They feed us so we feel grateful. They heal us so we feel indebted. They show kindness so we forget they are enemy who caused this war, who attacked our nation, who killed our soldiers and destroyed our cities. This is strategy, sophisticated propaganda. We must resist. Her words hung in the tent like smoke, spreading and obscuring and making breathing difficult. Several women nodded, wanting to believe in an explanation that preserved their worldview against evidence threatening to demolish it. But others shook their heads, and Sachiko found herself standing without consciously deciding to do so, her teacher instincts activating in response to argument she could not allow to go unchallenged. 3 months, she spoke quietly but with force that made others lean forward to hear. 3 months they have had to stop this performance and reveal true intentions. 3 months we have been given food, shelter, medical care, safety from our own soldiers who beat us for surviving. When does manipulation end and sincerity begin? At what point do we admit that perhaps, just perhaps, we were lied to about who the real enemy was? The older woman bristled. You would believe Americans over your own countrymen. You would trust enemy propaganda over Japanese truth. Sachiko's laugh carried bitterness that surprised even herself. Japanese truth told us to jump from cliffs. Japanese truth said Americans would rape and torture us. Japanese truth came from officers who beat us with rifles for choosing life. I am uncertain I trust Japanese truth anymore. Ko stood then, using her cane for balance, though she barely needed it anymore. Her spine healed enough that walking caused only minor discomfort. Her voice, when she spoke, carried authority built from experience the others had witnessed but not personally endured. Captain Rodriguez could have let me die. It would have been easier. Cheaper, more efficient. I was enemy prisoner with spine injury that might not respond to surgery even with best treatment. He chose to operate anyway, spent hours repairing damage Japanese soldier caused. Used medicine worth more than everything my family owns. For me, enemy prisoner. Why? The older woman had no immediate answer, her mouth working soundlessly as she searched for explanation that fit her preferred narrative. Ko pressed the advantage. Because he is doctor. Because doctors heal. Regardless of nationality. That is principle. That is who he is. And we had principles too once. But our principles said I. Theirs say live. I know which I trust more. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable, 15 women confronting reality that their government had taught them to fear survival more than death, to value abstract honor over concrete existence, to see an enemy humanity as threat rather than potential salvation. The older woman looked around the tent, seeing no support for her position, seeing instead faces reflecting doubt and reconsideration, and the first tentative acceptance that everything they had been taught might have been designed to ensure they died rather than surrender. Evidence that would contradict official narratives. She left the tent without further argument, walking into October darkness that matched her isolation. The remaining 14 sat in renewed silence, processing transformation that had been building since Ko collapsed on that dusty road, and Americans ran toward her instead of away. Some cried, Others stared at letters from families who warned of dangers that had not materialized while ignoring kindnesses that had. All of them in their own ways began the painful work of dismantling beliefs they had held as fundamental truths and reconstructing understanding on foundations built from experience rather than propaganda. Yuki spoke into the quiet, her voice small but steady. My brother died because Japan could not provide medicine. Ko lives because America chose to provide surgery. That is not propaganda. That is not manipulation. That is just fact. And I do not know how to explain that fact to my family when this war ends and we return home. Ko reached across the space between them, took Yuki's hand, held it with strength that surgery and American medicine had restored. We tell them truth, she said simply. We tell them that hatred is taught, that mercy is choice, that sometimes the greatest enemies are those who teach us to fear our own survival. We tell them that we were saved by the very people we were instructed to fear and destroyed by those who claim to protect us. And if they do not believe us, at least we will have spoken truth into a world that desperately needs more of it. Outside the tent, generators hummed their steady rhythm, powering lights that would burn through the night so doctors could operate on wounded who arrived without regard for darkness or convenience. American soldiers passed on patrol routes, securing a compound that housed both their own injured and enemy prisoners with equal commitment to preventing breach. Far beyond compound boundaries, war continued its grinding consumption of lives and resources in futures. But inside one tent designated for civilian detainees, 15 Japanese women sat with chocolate bars and full stomachs, in clean clothing, holding letters that warned of horrors they had not experienced while living, horrors their families could not imagine. They were prisoners, they were safe, they were confused, they were transforming. And when they finally returned to Japan, they would carry stories that contradicted official narratives so completely that some would be accused of treason, while others would be quietly celebrated as survivors who had glimpsed possibility beyond nationalistic hatred. But that was future consideration. Tonight, they simply sat together bonded by shared trauma and shared salvation, trying to reconcile what they had been taught with what they had lived, and finding that sometimes the truth was simpler and more complicated than any propaganda could capture. The enemy had shown them mercy, and that mercy had broken everything they believed about who was truly dangerous in a world at war.